Throughout time, people across the world told each other tales of how they came to be, of heroes and monsters, romance and tragedy, death and rebirth. Mythology helped shape the ancient world, explaining the unexplainable. This is Mythology Unleashed. There are countless fantastic literary works of horror and science fiction, and many that have paved the way for new powers of creativity and thought provocation. Yet there is one title that seems to have a profound influence over practically all others. One that even predates Bram Stoker's Dracula: Frankenstein. The tale of an ambitious and foolhardy young scientist whose experiments take him down a dark path of obsession to harness powers beyond mortal man, leading him to create an abhorrent life form that unleashes terror and death to those in its path. The story is a classic among classics. The impact of Frankenstein cannot be overstated. The tropes of mad scientists, sympathetic monsters, and practically the entire science fiction genre as a whole can all trace their roots back to the 1818 novel. Centuries following its publication, Frankenstein remains one of the most influential works of literature in the horror and science fiction genres. And it was all conceived by the mind of English author Mary Shelley. Born Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin in London, England, August 30th, 1797, the woman who would go on to create the story of Frankenstein lived a life marred with sorrow, tragedy, and loss. Just 11 days after she was born, her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, a trailblazing feminist author, had died of puerperal fever, and a few short years later, her father, William Godwin, a noted author in his own time, would get remarried to a woman with whom the young Mary would have a tenuous relationship with, rife with envy and animosity geared towards the young girl. As time would go on, Godwin would find herself more and more displaced within the family, exacerbated by the arrival of a half-brother, and so would attempt to escape her day-to-day challenges through her writing. Being the daughter of an author, and having frequently been in the presence of her father's author associates, Godwin quickly became an accomplished writer, publishing a children's tale through her father's publishing house called Monsieur Nongtampau at the age of 11. When she was 15 years old, Godwin began an affair with Percy Bysshe Shelley, who would go on to become one of England's most renowned romantic poets, and who at the time was married with children. Godwin and Shelley eventually conceived a child together, a daughter named Clara, who tragically died within a few days of being born, and the following year would give birth to a son named William. During the summer of 1816, an unusually cold and stormy summer, more akin to winter weather, the couple and their son would spend the season in Geneva, Switzerland, with their friend, Lord George Gordon Byron. While there, their host challenged everyone to a contest to see who among them could write the best horror story. It was there that the 18-year-old Mary Godwin began the first draft of what would go on to become Frankenstein.
I busied myself to think of a story which would speak to the mysterious fears of our nature and awaken thrilling horror. One to make the reader dread to look around, to curdle the blood and quicken the beatings of the heart.
After marrying Shelley in December of 1816, and many months of expanding upon the original short story, Mary Shelley published the first edition of Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, in January of 1818, foregoing credit of authorship until the release of the third edition in 1831. Shelley had no shortage of influence when it came to crafting her grisly tale of terror. At the time of the story's conception, the Age of Enlightenment had left a profound impact on European culture. The Industrial Revolution was gaining traction, and the age of Romanticism had arisen as a means to counter the perceived coldness of scientific progress and manufacturing advances. It was a time of political upheaval, social changes, and the lust for knowledge and achievement greater than ever. Yet many questioned if the price of such enlightenment and technological advancement was too great, whether or not the quest to achieve such a prize was always humane or ethical, and if those responsible were too preoccupied with whether or not they could reach their goals, that they did not consider if they should. These themes of enlightenment versus romanticism, emotion versus reason, and man versus nature permeate throughout Shelley's novel, and are the ever-present struggles of the titular character. Shelley was also strongly influenced by various written works of the time, including the romantic poems of her own husband, which challenged the societal norms in favor of subjectivity and imagination. Her father's book, Things as They Are, which tackled subjects of challenging the powers that be. John Milton's Paradise Lost, an epic telling of the biblical story of the creation and fall of man, that centered on free will and moral consequence of challenging higher power. And Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, an early product of British Romanticism that concerns themes of consequence, guilt, and madness. During her time spent in Geneva, Lord Byron was said to have read to his guests an 1812 publication called Phantasmagoriana, a collection of German ghost stories and folk tales, the vast majority of which centering around reanimating the dead. Yet the most profound of Shelley's influences, more so than any folklore or literary work, were nightmares, namely those concerning her own past, of challenges within her own family, and the loss of her first child. In her letters, Shelley recounted a peculiar nightmare in which she saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside a thing he had put together, the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then on the working of some powerful engine, showing signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. This haunting dream would become the brick and mortar of her legendary novel. Unlike Dracula, there are little to no pre-existing fantasy elements within Frankenstein, such as magic, monsters, or supernatural beings. Rather, the fantasy and science fiction elements would come later as a result of human error, not unlike the later story of Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The sole supernatural aspect of the story is the creation of life from non-living matter, and the reanimation of dead tissue. The concept of people coming back from the dead is a notion found in practically every mythology found across the world, yet it manifests in drastically different ways, sometimes beautiful, and other times horrifying. There are stories of resurrection, such as the biblical tale of Lazarus, the Hindu story of Satyavan, or the Aztec tale of Quetzalcoatl, where a person has died in some manner, yet through divine powers is brought back to life, often stronger and more beautiful than ever before. And then there are tales of a person dying and becoming an undead revenant through a curse or dark sorcery, such as a vampire, a ghoul, or a zombie, that may bear at least some resemblance to the human that they once were, but were more or less a hollow shell void of all humanity, existing only to feed upon the flesh and blood of the living. But the creation granted life by Dr. Frankenstein differs from any resurrected being or undead creature of legend, in that the body crafted by Frankenstein was never alive as it was, rather a fabrication of both natural and artificial materials, rendering it an inanimate object to begin with. The concept of creating a living being from non-living matter, be it flesh or other inanimate material, is also an age-old feature found in myth and folklore. In Greek mythology, the gods granted life to a massive bronze statue called Talos, powering him with ichor so that he may protect the island of Crete from invasion and foreign threats, yet could not differentiate between friend and foe, and so unintentionally held the island and its people hostage until he was at last stopped by the sorceress Medea. Another Greek legend, discussed at length in Ovid's Metamorphoses, concerns the sculptor Pygmalion, who fell in love with an ivory alabaster statue he created of a woman named Galatea, later granted life by the goddess of love, Aphrodite. Inuit mythology tells of Tupilaq, artificial creatures fashioned from animal parts and children's bones by shaman that could be used as dutiful servants, as well as lethal assassins. In Hebrew legend, a Maral named Rabbi Judah Low created a gargantuan clay man known as the Golem in order to protect the Jewish quarter of Prague from anti-Semitic attacks, yet went on a rampage when its shem was not removed on the day of the Sabbath, only stopped when the Maral intervened and deactivated the Golem permanently. Much like Frankenstein's creation, many of these beings were created out of passion, stemming from powerful emotions of love, duty, or vengeance, but many of them were capable of and responsible for great suffering in the world around them, a result of a human-like disconnect. Yet something that separates Shelley's monster from these mythical creatures is that Frankenstein brought the creature to life through means of science rather than magic or the work of the gods. Furthermore, while resurrected gods, undead monsters, and animated automatons always maintained a separation with ordinary mortals, Frankenstein's creation was very much human in nature, despite all appearances. Though frequently incorrectly referred to as Frankenstein, the famous monster is never given a proper name anywhere in the novel, often referred to as the monster, the creature, a wretch, a devil, a demon, and other less than savory names by those who encounter him, especially by his creator, who regards him with contempt, disgust, and fear. And while the image of Frankenstein's monster in the public eye is famously modeled after the Jack Pierce makeup worn by Boris Karloff in the 1931 film adaptation, complete with a flat-top head, mechanical attachments, grayish-green skin, slow wit with belabored speech, and a lumbering gait, Shelley's depiction was quite different. Frankenstein's monster was fashioned by cobbled-together pieces of dead people, though while proportionate in size, was ultimately massive, at an imposing 8 feet tall in height, and possessed great strength, speed, and agility beyond those of ordinary mortals. What's more is that the monster had flowing black hair and pearl-white teeth, beautiful attributes that horrifically paralleled his yellowed flesh, stretched tightly across its musculature and showing many of the body's inner workings, and his watery eyes that appeared dull white in color. Though frightening in overall appearance, it must be noted that the Frankenstein monster is not inherently evil. Rather, he was very human, capable of learning and feeling and exhibiting intense emotion. And when he was cruelly abandoned by his creator, he was flung into a world gripped by superstition and societal expectation, and so becomes the victim of humanity's calumny and consternation, greeted with fear and violence everywhere he turns, and reacting with violence often as a means to defend himself. As a result, the creature develops an intense hatred of mankind, and when he learns just who is responsible for bringing him into the world without teaching him about it, or being there to defend him from it, he embarks on a bloody mission of vengeance against his creator. The Frankenstein monster is one of the most complex monsters in all of storytelling history, with a unique appearance and origin, coupled with a complex character, embodying the unpredictability and raw power of nature itself, and serving as an interesting parallel to Victor, one being a learned and ambitious man of reason who callously abandons his creation to suffering and refuses responsibility for his actions, while the other is a hideous and grotesque being fueled by emotion akin to that of a young child who lashes out when threatened. Both are tragic figures, capable and responsible for great harm. Yet which one is truly the monster? In the novel, Victor Frankenstein is born into a wealthy family in the Republic of Geneva, growing up with a happy childhood filled with great love, friends, and family, wanting for nothing, and greatly curious about the world around him. His curiosity leads him to studying a wide field of subjects in the realm of science, namely biology, chemistry, and early electricity, even garnering interest in alchemy, namely the works of Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, an alleged occultist with a fascination for reviving the deceased. Early on in the story, as told by Victor himself, we see Frankenstein's childhood in a romantic, almost fairy tale-like light, as well as a fatal flaw for the young Victor, possessiveness, as we see him cling on to those around him, especially a girl named Elizabeth, an adopted sister, whom Victor eventually falls in love with, and he sees as a gift from his family, essentially his to own. A beautiful scene, a perfect status quo, marred by an early fatal flaw, is a classic foreshadowing of an oncoming tragedy, one that will shape Victor's life and those around him. That tragedy eventually comes when his mother dies of scarlet fever, forever grafting sorrow to the young man's soul, and sending him on his path of destiny. He attends school at the University of Ingolstadt, where he intends to become a great scientist who uses his knowledge to help the world. During his time at Ingolstadt, Frankenstein's fast learning and aptitude for science earn him great respect among his colleagues, but soon becomes obsessed with his studies and his ventures, going as far as to neglect hygiene and social interactions, and even stops writing home to his family. Many scholars have compared the story of Frankenstein to the old Germanic folktale of Faust, who made a deal with the devil to grant him arcane knowledge and great pleasures for a number of years in return for his soul. In this instance, Victor sells his being and soul to science in return for arcane knowledge not meant to be known by man. Victor's obsession with the secrets of life and death bear fruit as he discovers a scientific principle known only to him that would allow him to create life from non-living matter. Over the course of the next 2 years, Frankenstein labors in a makeshift laboratory in the attic of his boarding house, creating a being using human and animal body parts, acquired from charnel houses, fresh graves, dissecting rooms, and even slaughterhouses. As Frankenstein assembles his creature, his delusions of grandeur begin to grow exponentially, imagining himself as a godlike figure to a new race of beings created by himself, though has a number of fleeting doubts in regards to the ramifications of his actions. Shelley likens her character of Frankenstein to a modern Prometheus, in reference to the Titan from Greek mythology, who was responsible for the creation of mankind, and for granting them the gift of fire, an act that causes a chain reaction leading to humanity's hardships, as well as eternal suffering from Zeus, being chained to a mountain as a monstrous eagle ate his entrails each day before regrowing each night. Much like Prometheus, Frankenstein would succeed at creating human life by his own hand, and as a result, would endure suffering for the rest of his days. The exact method as to how Victor succeeds in bringing life to his creation is kept vague, though it is implied that the scientific principle utilized required the entirety of his knowledge of biology, electricity, chemistry, physiology, and even alchemy. Regardless of how he brought the creature to life, Frankenstein is immediately horrified by his creation and flees in terror. At this point and going forward, the story becomes a full-fledged gothic horror tale, complete with elements of suspense, anxiety that never leaves, and a grotesque monster. Frankenstein even begins to have nightmares of his deceased mother rising from the grave as a zombie. When Victor finally garners the courage to return to his laboratory, he finds the monster has mysteriously vanished. And though momentarily relieved, the realization that his creation is still out there somewhere begins to haunt the young scientist. As Victor is tended to by his childhood friend Henry Clerval and is taken home to Geneva, the monster takes a coat from the lab and makes his way into the nearby forest, where he slowly but surely begins to learn of the world around him. He would learn the difference between night and day, heat and cold, learn how to forage for food, what different sounds and different smells meant, and even learn about fire and how to feed it. 3 days later, the monster at last comes face to face with people, but his terrifying appearance, coupled with his inability to communicate, frighten people to the point that they attack him on sight, despite doing no wrong. Early on in the story, the Frankenstein monster is quickly established as an outcast who does not fit in with normal society, an aspect that for centuries has been associated with the mysterious and the untrustworthy, and as such has been given to monsters of legend, from Grendel in the Epic of Beowulf, to goblins in English folklore, to the various giants found in world mythology. After an ordeal with scared villagers pelting him with stones, the creature finds shelter in a hovel attached to a small cottage deep in the countryside, owned by a blind man and his family. And it is from here where he safely learns language and history and to read, learns of love and emotion, human nature, and the beauty of music, all by observing the family in secret. The creature grows fond of the family, and repays them by gathering firewood and doing chores during the night, so as to not be seen and potentially frighten them. Here we see a different side of the creature that no one else does. A caring, generous, and compassionate heart that belies his gruesome outward appearance. A lot of monsters of mythology, such as Medusa and the Minotaur of Greek mythology, or Fenrir in Norse mythology, are not evil by nature. Rather, they are victims of fate and circumstance, killing and committing atrocities out of survival, or in retaliation for harm done to them by mankind or by the gods. And the Frankenstein monster here is no different. Yet despite his warm heart, the creature receives no kindness in return, for when he reveals himself to the family, they beat him until he flees, despite the protests of the blind patriarch. The family abandons the cottage, leaving the creature to feel abandoned once again, and breaking his heart. But the blows continue as he finds Frankenstein's journal in one of the coat pockets, and discovers how he was created, and how he was cast aside by the very man who brought him to life. Heartbroken and enraged, the monster burned the empty cottage to the ground, and vowed revenge against Frankenstein. The monster makes his way from the forest near Ingolstadt all the way to Geneva, immune to the weather and never resting, his heart set on vengeance. And yet, something stirs within the creature, a hatred for humanity, yes, but also an unbearable loneliness. In the creature's mind, Frankenstein must suffer, yet he may be the key to his salvation. When he at last arrives in Geneva, he finds a small boy playing in the forest, and attempts to make friends with him, only to be met with fear and the discovery that this young lad is William Frankenstein, Victor's younger brother. In the blink of an eye, the monster kills the boy, and succeeds in framing the boy's babysitter for the murder, leading to her being hanged. In many stories of monsters, dark fantasies, and meddling with powers beyond comprehension, long before the main character has to face their fate, it is the innocent who are placed in harm's way, and sometimes are even killed. Examples of this can be found in various Grimm's fairy tales, such as Sleeping Beauty, Hansel and Gretel, or The Pied Piper, where an adult character acts carelessly or cruelly, and it is ultimately the children who must suffer as a result, by being cursed, kidnapped, or having to risk their lives against wicked villains and monsters. Distraught by the death of his brother, well aware of who the real murderer was, and knowing it was his own fault, Victor ventured to find solace in nature, and soon came face to face with his creation once again, asking for an audience under the notion of peace. The creature tells his creator of what had happened to him after escaping from the laboratory, of the family in the cottage, his learning, and of the cruelty he had endured from man, all because of his appearance. He also revealed how he learned of his unusual birth and subsequent abandonment, and how he had grown to despise humanity, most of all his creator. For a moment, both creator and creation have a moment of understanding. The creature should have been Frankenstein's Adam, but had instead become as that of the fallen angel. The creature offers a deal to his creator. If Frankenstein creates for him a female companion, then he and his partner would leave the world of man behind, never to return. But if Frankenstein fails to produce, or outright refuses him, then the creature will cause him untold suffering, the likes of which no man has ever endured. Here Frankenstein comes to a crossroad, a tool used in storytelling to illustrate a hard choice placed before the character. And whatever he chooses, he would have no choice but to reap the consequences of his own actions. And so Frankenstein initially agrees to his creation's demands, but he soon becomes filled with dread over the potential of a race of these monsters spawning to plague mankind, and so destroys his work. Enraged, the creature declares to his creator that if he would deny him his wedding night, he would be with him on his. The monster had made good on his promise, proceeding to ruthlessly kill Elizabeth on the night she and Victor were married, along with Victor's friend Henry, and the whole ordeal causing Victor's father to die of grief. Heartbroken and enraged, Victor declared vengeance upon his creation, and he chases the monster for miles and miles, to the very reaches of the Arctic Circle. But the toll the pursuit takes on Frankenstein pushes him to the brink of death, nearly succumbing to exhaustion and hypothermia, before he is at last rescued by Captain Robert Walton, who is eagerly and recklessly leading an expedition to discover the North Pole. In his final moments, Frankenstein regales the curious captain with his tragic story, warning him not only of the monster, but of the dangers of obsession and blind ambition, before finally succumbing to his failing health. Frankenstein's ultimate fate harkens back to themes found in various Greek myths, such as the tales of Oedipus, Theseus, and Hercules, where one often meets their destiny on the path to avoid it, and the evil one creates would ultimately destroy them. When the creature learns of his creator's death, he is overcome by grief, for though his creator never loved him, he was still his father. And so the creature, finished with mankind, opts to incinerate himself at the northernmost extremity of the world, and disappears into the frozen wasteland, never to be seen again. More than 200 years following its publication, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is still heralded as a literary masterpiece, and has gone on to become one of the most influential works of fiction ever written. With its compelling themes of reason versus emotion, science versus nature, humanity, obsession, grief, vengeance, madness, and sanity, coupled with its gothic elements and compelling characters influenced by mythology, folklore, pre-existing literature, and Shelley's own personal experiences, make the story truly timeless. The characters of Victor Frankenstein and his monster have become some of the most studied and celebrated figures in all of fiction, blurring the lines between protagonist and antagonist, and making readers everywhere ponder what makes a monster and what makes a man. The story of Frankenstein has been adapted into stage plays, radio productions, modern literature, comic books, and countless films, the most famous of which being the 1931 Universal horror film by James Whale, starring Colin Clive as Dr. Frankenstein.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
And Boris Karloff as the monster. As the inaugural science fiction novel and a quintessential horror tale conceived by so young an author, the story of Frankenstein has become embedded within popular culture for all time, granting Mary Shelley and her legendary novel a form of everlasting life.